Good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to yet another SmartQA Musings on probing and prompting. As we all know, that SmartQA Musings is just a gentle flurry of interesting thoughts. Today we have an interesting webcast, which is more conversational in nature. Before I get to the introductions, I'm going to just set the context as to what we are going to talk about today. And I want to kind of set what is probing, and then we'll move along to our discussion of today. To set the context, just to ensure that we are on the same plate, to me, probing is something more deeper. It is to seek, it is to question, it is to see far or see the bigger picture, in addition to seeing close, the nearer picture. And it's also about going deep. So what does it mean in the context of assurance? It is about using the idea of probing as a much more meaningfully elevated than what we might deem as simple testing. And therefore, probes really are something beyond the scenarios and cases which we are normally accustomed to. So think about probes as at the lowest level, we have specific scenarios and cases to evaluate, to validate a system. At a slightly higher level, think of it as probes as also as direction to go, indicating what criteria to look for and meet, what potential issues to look for and stuff like that. And at the highest level, think of the probe as possibly ideas. You might call it test idea if you like, and test ideas to try out. So the aggregation of the notion of specific scenarios, cases, criteria, issues as potential directions, and the highest level of idea is the notion of probes. And the claim that I am going to make that probes are probably an interesting way to assure smartly. Given this background and given what we are today, where we have far more intelligent systems powered by Gen AI today, we're trying to look at in this webcast, in this SmartQA Musings webcast, okay, if this is what probing is, then how could it be, what could be benefit from the idea of prompting, which is a gentle AI stuff. So this is structured as an interesting conversation on SmartQA as the act of probing, which is largely driven by the human intellect, the intelligence that we all possess. And today, because we've got some amazing technology, where powered by Gen AI, we have the idea of prompt, and we also use words like prompt engineering. And to look at it as to where is probing, where is prompting, what is the relationship, how do they coexist, is what this discussion is all about. And it is an interesting discussion with Mr. Rangarajan, who is the Chief Executive of Man-Machine Systems, a pioneer and been working on AI before it became Gen AI. So we're talking nearly 35, 40 years ago. And he's also the director of Stack Software Private Limited. Okay, so I guess I will stick to the human side of business, and Ranga would stick to the, machine intelligence. As you see, his other company is Man-Machine Systems. He's been pioneering that for many decades. So I guess it's going to be an interesting take in the next 20, 25 minutes. Welcome, Ranga.
Thanks a lot, Ashok, for inviting me for this webcast.
Thank you. So now, before we get on to the topic, just a little bit of a housekeeping. When we say smart assurance, I just want to kind of say, okay, what is smart assurance? Smart is also another beautifully overabused word. I mean, we have got smart in anything today, I guess, including a toaster, right? But what we mean really is we are trying to shift the focus from a mere notion of evaluation, of looking forward to uncovering some issues given a certain spec, to something more larger to be able to probe, which means I am looking for certainly the notion of interesting unknowns. I'm not even necessarily looking for issues. I am actually trying to understand, trying to explore, and in the process, I may stumble upon bugs, right? But I may have other interesting observations and suggestions, so on. So therefore, the idea of probing is much more expansive, and therefore, we could probably give it a better name and better context and say, hey, this is much more smarter probably, and therefore the context is smart assurance, right? And now to get to the business on hand, what is probing really? As I briefly alluded to as setting the context, probing really is about questioning, observing, note-taking, ideating, spotting issues, suggesting improvements, and probably many more. Think of it as two major aspects. One, the notion of a probe that occurs in your head, the intellectual probe, bit of a Sherlock Holmesian kind of an idea, right? The second is the physical, executable probes. Maybe you have some set of probes which we call as test cases sometimes, which we run in a human fashion or in an automated fashion. So probes and probing, therefore, is one part human and one part automated and machine oriented. And it is something hopefully a little more elevated than test cases and scenarios. And therefore, that's why I set the context. So given that this is probing, I will let Ranga kind of help us understand where prompting comes in, what it is all about. Ranga, it's your call.
Sure. Thanks, Ashok, for a very nice and detailed explanation of what probing is. As you would have all understood, probing is with respect to understanding the behavior of a system from an intellectual standpoint, going deeper than normally what testers do. Likewise, when you talk about prompting, the context is similar, but it's slightly different. Here we are talking to some kind of a black box, an intelligent system, a language model in essence, and we're trying to understand what it knows and how it can help. How do we communicate with the language model then? We need a language, we need a medium. A prompt is simply kind of a question or a suggestion or a request. It's a request, a conversation with the language model. So our idea is very simple. The language model knows a lot. I want to benefit from it. How much does it know? How can it help? So we give a prompt and the system responds by saying, okay, this is probably what you meant. One thing we must be clear about is this prompt, as it is casually called, is not very simple. It actually is a fairly deep discipline by itself, and it's called prompt engineering. I will not go into the details, but just outline the basic ideas. So if you're talking to an intelligent system, like very often we do to anybody else, a human, we have to be very clear and concise about our expectations and the request. You cannot blindly say, do this. So you have to be very clear and concise. There is no ambiguity allowed here. Not only that, sometimes, depending on the complexity of the kind of answers that you solicit, you will have to provide the system sufficient context. Without the context, the system may not be able to give you the answer that you expect. So this is all very fundamental and part and parcel of prompt engineering. And one more very practical idea is also to be kept in mind. Many people think that if you have a language model, for example, ChatGPT, you ask a question, it will give the correct answer. It rarely happens that way. Even in my own experience with some amount of knowledge, I realized that if I were to ask the system some question, the answer it gives very often is very, very meager compared to what I'm expecting. So there is a whole process of, oh, this is what I meant, but you didn't understand it right. Okay, let me elaborate further. So it is a very iterative process, and getting the correct prompt so that the system is able to answer your question as expected takes substantial time. This is no different from probing as we do it software QA. So in essence, prompt is very similar to probing because we ask the language model something and we expect it to provide some meaningful answer, and crafting the prompt is very similar to probing the system. Yes, Ashok, go ahead.
Thank you, Ranga. So I've tried to put this picture as in terms of the left side, as you can see, the human aspect, the human probing piece, and the right side. And I would, when we were talking about this and when we were discussing, then I was asking, so what is intelligence? And he was helping me understand what is smartness and where does the complement come from? And he was trying to give me the notion of decrypting this in terms of saying, what is knowledge, what is responsiveness, response, and how do I react, and what is intelligence, and therefore how they collaborate. So I think, Ranga, probably you might want to elaborate the picture here.
Yeah, definitely. So on the left side, let us say we have a human brain. A human. We are talking about an individual human here. And on the right side, we have an intelligent system. So where is the fundamental difference between the two, and where is the similarity between them? As you can see from the box beneath, human as an individual has some amount of knowledge. We all have some kind of knowledge. But more than the knowledge, what is important and relevant for a human being and what distinguishes a human from many other beings is the amount of intelligence that we possess. So we have to be very careful here. How is intelligence different from knowledge? Knowledge is just some static piece of information that you get from somewhere on the net. But intelligence is your fundamental ability to reason. In other words, how do you apply a knowledge to solve a specific problem? I might have taught you calculus and physics and so on, but it doesn't mean that you can apply that everywhere. So physics is knowledge. But then if you come to a real world situation and you have to get off a fast moving train, you realize that you cannot do it. So that requires reasoning. So applying knowledge to solve a specific problem is where intelligence comes in. So humans do possess some knowledge, but a lot of intelligence compared to the other side. On the other side, we have the intelligent system. What you see interesting here is the system seems to possess a lot of knowledge. At least if you talk about large language models these days, they have been trained on vast amounts of data, trillions and trillions of bytes of data. So it is expected that they will possess more knowledge than any single human being. On the other hand, you also notice a paradox there. The intelligence component there is much less compared to a single human being. It is only expected. What we are saying here is that the ability to reason, make inferences using the knowledge is much less, in fact, less than a child when it comes to an AI system compared to human being. So overall, we have some kind of an interesting relationship between the two. Humans possess a little bit of knowledge, a lot amount of intelligence, and the machine has a lot of knowledge, but a less amount of intelligence. So if we are able to work together, definitely there will be a synergy and both can benefit. That's what this diagram tries to convey. Yeah, sure.
Oh, that's a nice explanation for sure. And that, I think, is what Ranga was alluding to. So if I go back to the picture and start decorating it, if you will, and my part of decoration is I'm more focused from the human side. So it's like saying, hey, if a human is aided by AI, to test smartly, which is like this, I work with an AI model using prompts, then what it seems to me is I have a good probing system. I have a system to probe well, let's say, and therefore I'm able to come up with good probes, which is questions to see far, near, deep, and so on and so forth. In the process, understand, observe, etc. And therefore, as Ranga talked about, probably enables me to come up with great prompts. And then Ranga said, okay, it gives me a response. And now the question is that synergistic? And that's what he was trying, to kind of say. And therefore, Ranga, it's your call. So maybe I guess you said that responses have something interesting, synergist. How do we do that? How do we do that?
Okay, so as I said earlier, this is an iterative process. I take the example of probing and then start with an interesting prompt to the system asking a question. The system comes with an answer, and very often, you may not believe it, I am surprised by the answer it gives because I found something in it that I did not know ahead of time. So what is left of me now? I will take the answer given by the system, apply my concept of probing and getting a better prompt, improve my prompt again, go back to the system and say, okay, now here is an updated prompt. Can you give me a better answer? So this is the iterative process where the system starts with a basic prompt, guided by an intelligent probing system. I get the answers, use that to feedback and improve my probing process and the prompt, and then it's in an iterative process. We get overall a much better response than somebody could have done individually. Yeah.
So now when you look at this, now you really ask, okay, are we talking about the same stuff in slightly different, is just a slightly different transformation? And when we look at it, it seems like what Ranga alluded to some time ago as maybe they're just two sides of the same coin. Maybe one is the probing is what we do as a human, and prompting is what the machine does, so to speak. And somehow, if you are able to synergize with each other, then probably what we have is a much superior way of assuring smartly. Is that a fair statement, Ranga?
Yeah, I think the stress here would be on the word synergy. I think individually humans and language models or intelligent agents are enormously capable in their own way. But I think beauty happens, miracle happens when we come together. So I already have now an intelligent assistant. I am already intelligent, and he's saying, "Okay, boss, let us do better together." I think that kind of a boss-employee relationship is extremely wonderful and amazing in terms of producing real results. So the key word here I would like to stress is synergy. Yeah.
Okay. Nicely put. Thank you. So let's just take this and apply it in maybe about 3 or 4 slides that we have. I'm not going to walk you through with a real application, but the intent was to say, hey, if I were to really apply and do it on apply this in the context of a validation of a product, could be anything. I'm just picking Big Book My Show as an example. Could have been any application, so to speak. But I'm not here to test that application per se. I just want to set the context that now whatever that we are going to talk about is in the context of some specific application that you are. So now, what do we mean by that context? So now when we say probe, I kind of look at this idea of probing as consisting of activities which are broadly shifted into 3 phases. The first phase is to really look at it from the perspective of, do I really understand the larger picture, or do I jump into it and immediately probe, which as a part of my methodology, I call it as reconnaissance. Let's not worry about the word per se. But then the intent of the act of understanding the big picture as part of probing is really about seeking understanding of not just what the element that I'm testing or the entity that I'm testing, but it's something more. Okay, here is a new feature I'm introducing. Does it? What is the target market? Who are the categories of customers? Who are some end users is going to impact and use, and what do they expect and benefit? And what are the elements of the system or subsystem that I am validating? What are some key features or end-to-end flows and so on? So this, I'm not trying to put the complete list, so to speak, but I think to get the idea that the first part of probing is probably to get the larger context of a particular application or part of the application that I'm validating. I just use the example of a book. I should just illustrate that part. Now, the question here is, okay, if these are the things that I'm interested in understanding, and now we are talking about, here is an intelligent machine next to me, what can I do? And so Ranga, so this is my mental model of how I would like to probe. Where does prompting and AI come into picture?
Sure. Now, one thing I have to be careful about here is, I think I mentioned earlier that every language model, especially large language model, has a tremendous amount of knowledge. So for the example that Ashok has taken, that is the Book My Show, I assume that it is a kind of a common knowledge. Most people these days know about Book My Show or something similar domain. And therefore, what I want to stress here is, if I were to ask the system questions like probing about this Book My Show system, it must know something about the system. In other words, I'm assuming the system already possesses the basic knowledge required to answer this question. Maybe towards the end of the presentation, I'll share with you a little about, if it does not know, then how do you augment? That is a later part. Okay, so given that is the system knows about the Book My Show domain and the application, because most people know these days, and therefore the system will also know. So we may ask prompts like this. We may ask the system things like this. Okay, now what are the key personas for this app? And the system, very surprisingly, will be able to tell us many things. And in fact, I've seen this myself. Some of the answers will even be better than what a human QA person will be able to understand. So that is the depth of knowledge that the system has. Only thing is, it doesn't know how to utilize it, but the prompt tells the system, oh, this is what you are looking for, I'll help you. So likewise, we can form interesting prompts and questions for things like, okay, what are the expectations of users for this particular entity? What do you think are the various scenarios, various personas? All these questions can be easily answered by the system. But remember one thing, we assume for now, the system knows the context of the application. Okay, go ahead, Ashok.
Okay. So now if I go on saying, okay, I did get a little bigger picture, maybe I'm more ready to go into some details and maybe therefore explore to understand that particular entity in terms of what are conditions that govern the behavior, what might be some expectations stated as criteria, what might therefore be potential issues. Remember, I am trying to come up with probes And therefore, I'm going to use those probes to evaluate the system or understand something more in addition to evaluation. And therefore, I will come up with lower level scenarios and cases and maybe smarter checklists and maybe even scripts depending on how I want to evaluate. Right? So that's the next step that I would naturally do after once I get a bigger picture. So now I'm going to really think, where does probing fit in here? Does that help me? Because remember, we are not just using large language model assistance, the Copilot to generate code. We are looking at it something more aided by probing. I will now. So Ranga, how does it fit here?
Yeah. At every stage of this overall process, the good thing is the LLM can really help. So just as we go from the surface and go deeper and deeper, even prompting, by fine-tuning the kind of questions that we ask, we can ask the system to provide the right answer at that level of detail. So like, for example, we know a little bit about some entity, we can say what are the behavior conditions for this entity, or what could be some potential issues for this entity. So first thing is identifying those entities, and then go deeper and then say what are some issues for this particular entity. What is remarkable, as Ashok actually mentioned, is these LLMs these days are not just good at providing a static answer. They are also very good, not all of them necessarily, some of them are good in code generation. That is very, very interesting. Okay, so if you are a tester and you want to write automated test script in a specific language environment, chances are the LLM has already been trained on that kind of knowledge, and so it should be able to help you. So instead of spending hours and hours on writing an automation script, one of the things that we do very often, of course that is not testing, remember that's what Ashok is saying, we can take advantage of an LLM to automate that scripting process so that we can use it, but not usually directly. In my experience, the code generation has to be carefully analyzed. I have found lots of bugs and mistakes. Like any prompt, you need to fine-tune this prompt also. So it will give you a code script. You'll find that there is some blaring hole, gap, mistake in it. Then you will go and change the prompt. No, I didn't mean this. Please generate code for this, and generate much better code. But what I'm trying to say is the level of detail is only up to you. Depending on how you craft the prompt, the system can also react as intelligently as you can. And this is a great benefit because it saves you a lot of time and effort. And very often, as I even said earlier, it may identify issues that you as a human did not even expect. So this is the kind of synergy that we are talking about. Sure.
I just wanted to add to that, Ranga, when we were doing some experiments where the language it puts out, or if I have got something written out as probes, for example, could be scenarios, cases, ideas, etc. And if I am not as sharp, I guess the LLM helps me to sharpen some of those to help me do better. So like rewriting some scenarios or giving certain other things which sharpens the content. It is not the content, but it is the laying out of the content itself, so that.
Absolutely. Well met. Yep.
So I just wanted to point out that what we experimented sometime. And lastly, of course, coming to the last stage and say, okay, I have gone through the act of understanding the bigger picture, getting down to the detail, coming up with specific probes, maybe even automating it, running it, of course, iterating the test, so to speak, and then say, okay, I'm kind of done. So what would I want to do? I want to be able to say, how good are my probes and what is the outcome? And therefore, how good means, coverage, adequacy of what I do. And secondly, progress, which I think in some of those are reasonably well done in terms of quality, progress, and tracking by tools like Jira and Co. But then things is like, how do I know adequacy? How do I judge the health? How do I know my process and practice is doing well? Is also, exercise is also driven by good probing, which hopefully if I have a good method or a system to probe, helps me to do this job much better. And the interesting thing is, okay, now this is not related to a particular product alone. So where does prompting help us here?
Yeah. So what is interesting here is the phrase that I have used here, meta question. Very often, what we use LLM for is ask a question, get the answer. So the answer is a general term. What I can also do is ask the LLM to ask questions on my behalf. In other words, I will tell the LLM, what are some questions that I should be considering or focusing on with respect to the quality of the system? Then the system might say, okay, how is the performance? Okay, does it answer all inputs correctly? So the system, instead of giving a specific answer, that is what we are used to, I can also ask it to ask questions on my behalf and add it to my knowledge base. I think this is really beautiful and remarkable. As you go deeper in testing and etc., you will find this really very, very useful. Yeah.
Okay, and on a slightly different one, may not be directly related to prompting, but in the context of AI, I think one of the experiments that I think Ranga and me did many months ago was to take a set of defects and classify it into what we call as quality levels in our methodology to understand what are certain types of issues it is finding. So it actually generalized and bucketized these defects into various boxes. And that gave us a certain indication, am I really going after some interesting issues or am I just doing some superficial test? And that was an interesting exercise that we did, though it may not be directly prompt. But if you want to add anything, Ranga, before we jump.
Yes. Slide. Yeah, that's just outside of Gen AI. But then you see, machine intelligence is not just Gen AI. AI has been evolving over a period of time. And what we used was a machine learning model. Now, what we have in Gen AI is a more advanced language-based model, but it did not always be that way. So that was an initial stage of the experiment, and it worked. We were very pleased at that time.
Okay. Yeah. So in conclusion, if you were to kind of get to the end of the stuff, because I think you're probably going to be off by about a couple of minutes, but look at this entire stuff as not as saying, okay, I'm a human, you're a machine, and you're at my command, so you go, please do it. I don't think we're just like outsourcing our intellect to the machine, but what we're trying to do is to look at the AI model as an intelligent assistant and probably to harness that assistant's intelligence, who sometimes seems a little more smarter than me. I think the proper method is key, and that is your methodology, and so on and so forth. So that's why I've tried to put as, the brain part with one which is wired and kind of indicating, if you will, the notion. So your final parting remark and comments, Ranga, before we wind down.
Yeah, so this brings us to the original phrase that I used earlier, prompt engineering. We all used to joke in the initial days, what? Prompt engineering. But having gone into that a little bit deeper and spent lots of hours on that, I realized, as we were trying to hint earlier also, prompting is not simple. It's not like simply asking a question and getting the response. In order to make the intelligent assistant work intelligently, the responsibility lies with you. You have to spend a lot of time understanding what its limitations are, strengths are, come up with good prompts iteratively, and get the system working synergy. So this is a beautiful conclusion. Yeah.
And of course, one of the things, it's not exactly a full-fledged marketing, but basically that's what we've attempted to do, Ranga, Avinash and me. I've been working quite deeply on it in terms of trying to put together a probing assistant. We call this a smart probing assistant to test deeply and rapidly. I think we call the product, if you will, our assistant as a SmartQA. This is not a replacement to any of those kind of typical testing tools that we're conversant with. And if you're interested, maybe you can take the link and see. But I'm not going to go any deeper beyond that at this point in time. But just to let you know, yes, this is something that we've been experimenting with. How can I harness the power of AI? And as we all know, good probing requires good critical system thinking skills, general system thinking skills. And I think that is where the methodology comes in very handy. And when I use the word called method, Ranga was, he said, hey, use the word called proper method, which is not just about any method. The notion of proper method is very, very important. And I think that I understand, because critical thinking is not easy. I can think, but to think critically, to reason well and do something is interesting. And with that, I hope you had some bit of an insight into understanding that prompting is not just merely asking questions. There is a deeper sense, and it requires a good system of thinking and probing to be able to harness it. And finally, we work with it as an intelligent assistant. So on a lighter vein, assuming the marriages are interesting, it is the yin and yang between the male and the female, the man and the wife. And if both are in very good, are able to work very well, then the baby is beautiful. Otherwise, the marriage is interesting. So I guess with that, I will leave it, I will stop here. And I know that we were probably off the time by about a few minutes, but if you have any questions, comments, and so on, we'll see. But in concluding, the last thought, I think, is, I guess, what Ranga said. Compliments. I hope you appreciate this. And I think, Ranga, you want to just add a bit in terms of what is doing?
Just a couple of words about this. I earlier talked about how to augment the knowledge base of an LLM. Very often, the large language models possess the kind of knowledge that we probably are happy with. But if you do a lot of specialized work in a specific domain, then that may not help at all. It may not have that kind of knowledge. For example, if I want to do something in healthcare or in the financial market, then the system may know a little bit, but not everything that I want to process, simply because the knowledge may be proprietary. I may not have made it available on the internet. So we have domain-specific LLMs that are built from scratch most of the time, that are very good at that domain. They may not necessarily be very competent with respect to other domains, but in this domain, they are really good. And so there are many ways to augment the knowledge of an LLM. One is domain specificity, the other is fine tuning, and we can use that. There are many techniques. I don't want to get into the details, but overall, yes, it is possible to take an LLM, augment it with the knowledge that it may not possess, and make it good for the application that you have in mind. Yeah.
And maybe I want to add that what Ranga has been working on is to actually make a domain-specific custom GPT, as he calls it, for HyBIST, which means that particular LLM is in some sense knows more about our methodological HyBIST, and therefore maybe augment what we end up doing, right? And so I know this is not a class or nothing. It was just an interesting musings on a flurry of interesting thoughts. So if you have time and if you have some interesting thoughts, comments, anything else, I guess the only way is we can probably do a chat. I don't think voice will work, and we'll be able to see for the benefit of others. Is there anything that you want to? Your comments, thoughts, opinions, whatever. So I hope you got the idea that, here the LLMs can be put to a far more bigger use. It is not just about, just asking some interesting questions. It is not about just writing code and exploiting Copilot. I think we as people in the quality assurance area, where we are always struggling to look at the larger picture, general system thinking, and so on and so forth, which are more fuzzy, probably this is, in some sense, a brilliant boon. And like any other boon, has to be used with knowledge, care, and meaningfulness to harness the power. And of course, the program that we run as part of our transformation program, which is available in various flavors. The personal is more of an individual set of cohorts. We do bundle it along with the Do SmartQA Personal Edition, which I briefly mentioned. And that is part of the the program, which we give it off as lifelong free kind of a stuff. It's actually a Chrome extension. So if you actually go to Chrome store and search for Do SmartQA, you probably would find it. But without understanding the method, that extension may not be of tremendous use. And there is a part of it which has an intelligent assistant which actually interacts with ChatGPT.